Okay, David, if you're ready, we could kick this off for the night.
All right, let's do it. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dave Martin, Executive Director of Athletics at the University of Scranton. We have a special opportunity tonight to get to know Willie Mays Aikens. We call this event An American Life because I can imagine no life more thoroughly American in all its triumph and tragedy. Willie, as we know, reached the heights of athletic fame, becoming the first hitter to ever hit 2 home runs in 2 different games in the same World Series. What those of us who marveled at his swing didn't know was what he overcame to get there. Willie grew up in a shack in Seneca, South Carolina that had no heat or running water. His mother did all she could to raise him and his sister. He had a terrible stutter, and soon, logically, he discovered drugs to ease his pain. He did drugs while he played. He plummeted into addiction after drugs ended his baseball career. And then, worst of all, Willie was entrapped by an undercover officer in 1994. She compelled him to make crack cocaine for her, even though he never had any at his home. She encouraged him to make a certain weight of crack cocaine for her over-repeated visits to his home in order to trigger the mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Racism and systemic injustice doomed Willie as a boy to poverty. They doomed him as an addict to an unfair and extreme sentence. Willie's spiritual fire never went out, however. And today, here with us, he has become a leading symbol and spokesperson for sentencing reform, addiction counseling, and the transformation of America's drug laws. Moderating this evening are Professor Mike Jenkins, Chair of Scranton's Criminal Justice Department, and Professor Joel Kemp, until recently a Professor of Theology here at the University of Scranton. Mike will kick things off with 20 minutes or so on the nitty-gritty of Willie's incarceration and criminal justice issues. Then Joel will focus on the racial dimensions of Willie's story and his powerful, defiant spirituality. We encourage you to submit questions during the program, as Willie will spend the final 20 minutes or so responding to your queries. And now, the story of a rich American life.
Thank you, Dave. And we'll get started with the criminal justice portion of the discussion. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for logging on with us today. And I'm sure this is going to be a really interesting and moving conversation about many of the enduring issues of justice and faith and friendship and sports in American life. As Dave mentioned, he's the athletic director and he's played an important role in helping to organize this event and getting some of our student athletes involved. And I really appreciate that from the academic side of things as a criminal justice professor, because obviously, as we speak, history is being made and there are issues that are at our doorsteps that require our attention. And we are seeing that athletes have an important role in speaking out on many of these issues. And I believe that, we can swing a bat, we could pitch a fast baseball, we can dribble like all-stars, but I think at this university, given the Jesuit and Catholic nature of our education, it's important that students are able to do for others and to educate others about areas in life that may be secondary to their own experiences. And so we'll learn today through the story of Mr. Aikens a little bit about the criminal justice system and the time in the early 1990s when he experienced kind of the brunt of the criminal justice system. And again, I'm just looking forward to being able to hear from Mr. Aikens and to have our students and our student athletes really engage with these ideas and to be educated about the real impact of the work that our students in criminal justice will one day be doing. I would like to acknowledge the Slattery Center for the Humanities for helping to sponsor this event, as well as our other panelists, as I said before, David Martin and Joel Kemp. And of course, the man of the hour, Mr. Willie Mays Aikens. A little bit about the context of criminal justice before I turn it over to Mr. Aikens. And, one of the main parts, I think, of Mr. Aikens' story is the disparity in the crack versus cocaine sentencing laws that Mr. Aikens was sentenced under in the early 1990s. And many of us are aware of the 100-to-1 disparity, in which those who were found guilty of selling or possessing crack were sentenced much more harshly than those individuals who might have been convicted of selling or possessing cocaine. And so for Mr. Aikens' case, that meant that he had 2.2 ounces of crack, which is the equivalent of 1/10 of a pound, or about $3,700 in today's dollars in terms of its value. Comparatively, if that were a powder cocaine substance that he was sentenced under, that'd be the equivalent of 12 pounds of powder coke with a street value of almost $500,000. And in his sentence for that 1/10 of a pound of crack, Mr. Aikens was sentenced to 21 years in prison. Again, if you were sentenced at that time for powder cocaine, that would be just over 2 years in prison. So these disparities, and there are many in the criminal justice system, this is just one very real example of a disparity in sentencing that has racial implications, socioeconomic status implications. And again, Mr. Aikens will share his story about, from his own perspective, exactly how that has affected him. As Dave Martin said, it's an American story. And Mr. Aikens, his story really is an illustration of the pushes and pulls of the various mechanisms that affect one's behavior. He also exemplifies the effects of our society's response to that criminal behavior, and the experiences with the criminal justice system and some of the unintended consequences of it. He's experienced the outcomes of very questionable police investigative tactics, as well as I mentioned, the grave disparate impacts of people of color of the criminal justice system. And so with that little stage setting, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Aikens and just ask you to please talk a little bit about that time in 1993 and 1994 in which you were introduced to the wonders of the criminal justice system.
Before I get started, I want to thank you guys for having me on, and I just want to talk about a little part of my life before I became a professional baseball player. I grew up in Seneca, South Carolina. I grew up under a stepfather who's an alcoholic. I've never met my dad before. And studies have been done that kids that grow up without two parents in the home, they have a higher percentage of getting into trouble than people that are that share a home with their parents. At an early age, I saw the devastating effects of drugs because of my stepfather. He was an alcoholic. My stepfather died in 1968. He was frozen to death. They found him frozen to death on the railroad tracks. I was 14 years old. I had a speech impediment. I was a stutterer. And I stuttered up until I was a professional baseball player. As a professional baseball player, when you do well on the baseball field, the TV cameras, they want to talk to you after games and stuff. And I remember that I used to struggle on interviews and stuff like that. And today I praise God that I'm able to get in front of a camera or whatever and talk. I don't have no fear of my stutter, even though I do it sometime now, but just want to say that during that period while I was incarcerated and I rededicated my life to Christ, God, he took my stutter away from me. And I give praise and honor to him for allowing me to be able to do what I'm doing today. I never did drugs. I never drank while I was in high school. I experimented once or twice with marijuana. When I signed in 1975 as a professional baseball player, I didn't really have any experience about cocaine. And I went through the minor league system. I did well, went through the system really, really quick. 3.5 years, made it to the big leagues, and I got traded to the Kansas City Royals in 1980. But my last year with the Angels, I experienced cocaine. And I didn't really think anything about it I snorted some cocaine. And I really didn't think anything about it, but when I got traded to the Royals, you know, back in the 80s, it was a situation in baseball, whereas a lot of players was using drugs, cocaine and drinking. So somewhat the 80s was a party era for the ones that wanted to get high. And even though I had seen the devastating effects of drugs as a child growing up, you know, that never was a part of my thinking when I became of age and was able to make my own choices. That's why when we become adults, our destiny depends on the choices that we make. And we have to be careful about that. And if you're going to get into criminal activity or start doing things that can get you in trouble, you need to know what the punishments are. I think most criminals that commit crimes, they don't know what the consequences are if they get caught. And I'll kind of jump forward to 1994 when I caught that crack versus powder cocaine case. You know, I never knew there was a disparity between crack and powder cocaine. And the bill was passed in 1986 because they were having so much problems in the Black neighborhoods. But in 1983, while a member of the Kansas City Royals, I caught a cocaine case with 3 of my teammates. We met this guy in 81. He was a fan. And at one time, we had like 6 members of our baseball club going over to his house. And he used to follow us on road trips. And once again, I'll state that I knew a lot of players on all different teams that was getting high. They come into Kansas City, we had drugs for them. We go into their towns, whether it's Chicago, California, Oakland, wherever it might be, they had drugs for us. But to make a long story short, the guy that we knew, he got caught in 1983, and they had been watching his house, and they had tapped his telephone, and they had 4 of the 6 players. We had 6 guys going over to his house, and they had 4 of us on a tap from his telephone, and we eventually pled guilty, and the judge made an example of us, and he sentenced us to 3 months in prison and fined us $5,000. And after that, the Kansas City Royals, they didn't really want to have anything to do with me. They only kept one of the players. I got traded to the Blue Jays in the winter of 1983. And the prison that they sent us to was in Fort Worth, Texas, and it was a co-ed place. I mean, I spent 81 days in that place, and to be honest, I walked with a female almost every single day. I met this girl, and I walked with her, holding her hands and everything. And to show how I'm in trouble, and they tell us, don't seek the females or try to have sex with any of the females while you're incarcerated. And guess what I did? Well, I did just the opposite. Here I am still carrying on that kind of behavior. I did 81 days. I got out and I missed all the spring training. Make a long story short, I ended up having 2 bad years with the Blue Jays. And I got released in 1985. And I was blackballed. I wasn't able to find a job in the United States. And I'm telling this story because before all of this happened in 1994, I experienced a whole lot of stuff with drugs and alcohol. And in 86, I played in Mexico. I hit 46 home runs, drove in 154 runs, and I owned the batting average of all time in Mexico. I hit 454. And in 81, the Kansas City Royals went to Japan and played, and I hit like 7 home runs in 7 games. And after the series over there, the Japanese told me that they wanted me to come over there and play after my baseball career was over in the United States. And after my first year in Mexico, I couldn't find a job in the States. And the Japanese sent a representative to Mexico. This is why it is so very important, the decisions that you make, because years down the line, the devastating consequences of your decision, they can still haunt you. I caught my case in 83. Here it is, 1987, and the Japanese offered me a contract of $300,000 to go over there and play. I'm making $4,000 a month down in Mexico. In my last year in the big leagues, I made $600,000. So here I am, I'm thrilled to death to be going over to Japan to play baseball. When it come time for me to get a working visa, well, guess what? I couldn't get one because I had a criminal record. So now, my second year in Mexico, I got sick with hepatitis, and I go back home, and I got all this time on my hand, and I'm not doing anything. So I started back drinking. That's why when you become addicted to drug, any drug, and it's not alcohol, but alcohol is one thing that can lead a person back to their drug of choice. So when I started drinking, it eventually led me back to my drug of choice, which was cocaine. So for the next 4 or 5 years in Mexico, I'm playing baseball, and I become a smoker. I had been a snorter. Now I become a smoker, which is a more serious form of using cocaine. It's a powerful form. It's a more addictive form of using cocaine. So for the next 4 or 5 years, I'm in Mexico, and I'm destroying my life. But basically, I'm playing baseball, and I'm doing okay, so I thought everything was okay. Now shoot forward to 1993, I'm in Kansas City, and I had this incident that happened at my house, and a couple of females, they called the cops on me, and they came to my house to check it out, and nothing was going on, so they started watching me, and for 2 weeks, they watched me, and nothing really was going on. I was just partying at my house. You know, I didn't look at myself as breaking the law because I'm partying, snorting cocaine, and doing stuff like that. So they decide to send an undercover officer in on me. Like you were saying at first, Mike, this is how all of this started. A female show up at my house. I eventually get drugs for her 4 times. And each transaction that happened with this female, it was powder cocaine. But because she knew what the law was, she knew that if she could come to my house and leave my house with rock or crack cocaine, that I was facing a stiffer penalty. So on all of those occasions, I ended up cooking the drug for her. On 3 of those occasions, the deal went down away from my house, and we came back with powder cocaine. So that's why my lawyer tried my case on entrapment, saying that the undercover officer entrapped me to cook powder to crack because she knew that crack cocaine carried a stiffer penalty. Whereas I didn't have any idea about the laws of the drugs back then. But I was charged with 64 grams of crack cocaine. Now, I know you explained it, Michael, before I started talking, but I just want to explain it maybe a little bit clearer. And I'm not sure if it is or not, but the most you can make off of 64 grams of crack cocaine is $6,400. And that is if you sell it for $100 a gram, and that's what it go for. So in order for a person up under powder cocaine to fall up under the mandatory minimum 10-year sentence of 64 grams of crack cocaine, this person can have 6,400 grams of powder cocaine, which is 6.5 kilos. The monetary value, you kindly explained it. If you sell it for 1,000 grams equal a kilo. So like you said, $500,000, well, $600,000 basically. And you can take 6.5 kilos and supply a whole neighborhood. You know, I used to sit down and not trying to brag about it or anything. And that amount of drugs that I had, I could smoke it up within 2 or 3 days. But here you are given basically a drug dealer who can supply a whole neighborhood with 6.5 grams. And this person fall up under the same sentencing category as a person like myself who has 64 grams, 2.5 ounces, you could hold in one hand. I mean, Think about that.
It's pretty much your own possession, right?
Exactly. It doesn't make any sense. But I was portrayed in the newspapers in Kansas City as a drug dealer. So I go to trial and I lose. And when they kicked my door in, they found a 12-gauge shotgun in my closet. And I wasn't a felon, so I was able to own a gun. But make a long story short, the undercover officer, she made up a secondary report and said that I had that gun on one of the occasions that she came to my house, where she never put in any of her full reports that I had a gun. So a Kansas City, a police officer is not going to forget about a gun
Right.
if a person have that on the drug scene. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
And when this officer was telling this story about this gun, I couldn't believe it. I mean, they basically had me on the drugs. But here they are trying to give me 5 extra years. And by the way, if you get a gun charge on a drug sentence, that sentence cannot run the same as the drug sentence. It's consecutive. It's not concurrent. Make a long story short, I was found guilty on the gun and the drugs. So the judge, George Whipple, at my sentencing, you know, he told me, he said, Mr. Aikens, you used to be a prominent baseball player here in Kansas City. He said, look at you now. You trashed your life. And I had. So he gave me the top of the guidelines on the drugs, which were 12.5 years. He gave me 5 years on the gun, 17.5. And then he enhanced my sentence to level, which made it 20 years and 8 months. Now I'm getting ready to go to prison with a sentence like that.
Thanks for sharing that. We're actually coming to the end of the criminal justice portion, but just maybe 2 more minutes of kind of how, as you were going through it, obviously now, you know, you're 25 years out of that, and you spent a lot of time in prison, were released early because of the federal legislation under President Obama that reduced that disparity between crack and coke. But at the time in 1994, when you were sentenced, obviously it was a very different time. How were you experiencing it then, and kind of what did you think about your future? And then as you respond to that, I think we could then turn it over to Dr. Kemp to discuss some of the transformational aspects of your faith and writing and poetry as it helped to get you to where you are today.
Well, you know, I always felt like the sentence of 20 years and 8 months. I never expected to do 14 years of that sentence, because being a professional athlete, you know, when things had happened to me before on the streets of Kansas City, I used to get stopped a lot by the cops, and they would just recognize who I was and tap me on the shoulder, slow it down, Willie. So I always felt like that I was going to be able to appeal my case and win my case. Mm. It didn't happen like that.
Yeah.
And I'll get to the part after a while about when I was incarcerated and everything, and how I, rededicated my life to Christ and stuff like that. But, you know, we still have a strict criminal justice system in the United States today. And a lot of the laws that we have are still unfair to a lot of Blacks and Latinos. And you know, the situation with us as people is not going to get any better until we are able to look at ourselves in the mirror. And we are the ones that have to make the choices about what we are going to do. I got out of prison in 2008, and I've been on the streets for 12 years now. You know, I made a conscious decision that I didn't want to do drugs anymore. And the only reason I was involved with criminal activity because I was using drugs. And I think it was so unfair back then, and even to now, I think they've implemented that when a person is charged on a drug crime, some states, you know, they have drug courts that a person can go to, and if they complete the courts, they won't receive any a prison time. But back when I was sentenced, there wasn't anything like that.
Yeah.
And when you got sentenced, you went straight to prison.
Yep.
And I can also say that, you know, that the Kansas City Police Department, when they arrested me and when they set me up, as you were saying earlier, hey, Michael, they set me up. But, you know, it was a setup that was arranged by God. And, you know, I believe that God used the police department to save me. And I didn't see it this way at first when I was incarcerated. And it took me years before I finally realized that being taken out of that situation and going to prison had saved my life.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. And Mr. Aikens, it's always good to talk with you again in this format.
There you go.
As just a preface to kind of our part of the conversation, I want to personally take a quick moment to say thank you to all who organized this event and put it all together. As was mentioned earlier, I taught at the University of Scranton for about 3 years, although I've moved to Emory University and Kemp School of Theology there. It's still nice to be connected to family at the University of Scranton. So it's good to be back with you even in this virtual format. Mr. Aikens, I wanted to pick up our conversation where you last talked about kind of the impact of your faith and giving your life to Christ and how you saw his hand at work in all of this. If I can take you back to the beginning, when you grew up in South Carolina, can you describe kind of your religious life then and sort of kind of your habits then and where you understood God to be at work then how that compares to maybe later in your life?
Well, I accepted Jesus Christ when I was 13 years old. And I didn't do it because of anything that was going on in my household. I used to watch my neighbors go to church, and I became interested in going to church. My mom, she didn't go to church. My stepfather, you know, it just wasn't going on. So I started going to church with my neighbors. And at 13, I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal savior, and I was baptized. So all during this period, when I was drinking and drugging or whatever, you know, I talked the talk, but I never walked the walk. Even as a professional baseball player, I read my Bible. I took my Bible with me on the road trips. But I was out there in the streets, man. I was out there in the streets chasing females, you know, making bad choices that I shouldn't be doing. And God wasn't really a part of my life back then, even though I pretended by reading the Bible that I was serving God. But I can honestly say one thing, that, you know, we can abandon God, but God, he never abandoned me. Now, I didn't see it that way back then when I was drinking and drugging, because I wasn't focused on God. I was focused on making Willie Aikens happy, partying in the streets, playing baseball, and doing whatever. And, you know, I always say that I grew up without a father. But the honest truth was I grew up and I've always had a father. And he's been my heavenly father. And a lot of times God allowed tragedies or things to happen in our lives to get our attention. And it took me a while to come to this conclusion and stuff like that. But when I received that sentence in 1994 of 20 years and 8 months, I firmly believed that I was going to win my case on appeal. There was no doubt in my mind about it. And while I was incarcerated, 2 or 3 years would pass. And before I knew it, 10 years had passed in my life, and I was still in prison looking at more time. So after being incarcerated for 2 years, I rededicated my life to Christ. And I didn't do it because I was ready to change my life. I did it because I made a promise with God that if you help me get my sentence reduced, well, then I would change my life. And I had no plan of changing my life. My plan was to get out of prison and go back to drinking and drugging and chasing the females. But like I would say, all this time would pass. But during those 10 years that passed and I lost all of my appeals, I got denied by President Clinton, well, for clemency. It was on his desk, and come to find out that he never looked at it. President Bush denied me twice for clemency. But during this period of time, I was reading my Bible. I was going to church. I was going to chapel. I was getting up in chapel, sharing my story. My little girls were 5 and 6 when I went to prison. When I got out, they were 19 and 20. But I became a better father when I was incarcerated than I was on the streets. And I took 2 15-month rehabilitation programs. You know, prison is prison. And most people look at prison as a bad thing. But the correct name for prison is a correctional institution. So if a person decides to make a change in his life while he's incarcerated or in prison, it can be done. So all this time passed while I'm incarcerated, and I didn't know it, but I was gaining a spiritual life. And I got a chance to know my little girls, whereas on the streets, my family, to me, it wasn't important. And after being incarcerated for 12 years or whatever, Simpson Commission made a recommendation that the guidelines, the sentencing guidelines for crack cocaine be amended. Make a long story short, it was amended. It wasn't retroactive. 6 months later, it became retroactive. And when it became retroactive, 19,000 people that was incarcerated became eligible for a sentence reduction. That's how I got my sentence reduced. And after it became retroactive, the judge had sentenced me to 15 and a half years on a bribery charge. When I first caught the case, I got out on bail or bond, and I violated my bail or bond, and I had a court date, and I never reported to it. So he charged me with obstruction of justice. So when he sentenced me, I pled guilty to it. He gave me the statutory maximum of 15 years, where as the guideline, it was only 27 years. So I'm talking to my lawyer, and she's like, Willie, if you get a reduced sentence on the drugs, you still might have 15 years on the bribery charge. Make a long story short, it was a illegal sentence. So finally, the prosecutors got together and the judge agreed to give me my release. Now this is like 14 years later. It took me back 12 years while I was incarcerated. And when I rededicated my life to Christ after a couple of years. You know, the Bible says that when we walk in the ways of the Lord, that God will bless our lives. And even though I didn't realize at the time that while I was walking in the ways of God and he was working on Willie Aikens, and I had decided to change my life. And when God knew that I was ready to get out of prison and go home, he allowed me to get my sentence reduced. So that blessing that I was looking for to come quick, it didn't come quick. It came after I was incarcerated for 14 years. But once again, you know, when God is ready for us, you know, it always works out for us. And that's basically how I gained my spiritual life while I was incarcerated. And even up to today, you know, waking up every morning praying, reading my Bible every day, having a 9-year-old daughter, having her in a spiritual school. Just that God, you know, when we have a spiritual life, there's a little voice that's inside of us that speaks to each and every one of us. And all during those periods of time when I was drinking and drugging, that little voice used to speak to me. But I didn't pay it any attention. Everything else that I was doing was more important to me than that little voice that was telling me, Willie, better stop doing what you're doing. You're gonna get caught eventually. Somebody's gonna rob you. You might overdose on drugs. And there were times that I did drugs that they scared me. I didn't pay that little voice any attention. And that's the difference of having a spiritual life and not having a spiritual life. That when we allow that little voice inside of us to grow to the point where as we listen to it, and I believe I'm at that point right now, and it's been a blessing for me and my family.
Absolutely. So, as an old Baptist preacher, I was reminded of the passage and kind of the phrase that God may not come when you want him, but he always comes right on time.
There you go.
That kind of struck me in what you were sharing, Mr. Aikens.
Yeah.
One of the questions that came up that sort of ties into part of what you were sharing deals with the question of how did your faith, your walk with Christ help you deal with kind of all the setups in your experience, kind of the racism that you encountered in the context of your encounter with the criminal justice system. How did you kind of use your faith to not become angry or bitter as a result?
Well, I think during those years that led up to me getting released, by just having God in my life, having God as my partner, it gave me hope. It allowed me to build a character. It allowed me to take when I first went to prison, an old timer, this guy I met in prison, he told me, he said, Willie, you can do hard time or you can do soft time. I said, well, what is hard time? He said, hard time is having your body inside a prison and having your mind on the outside. And I said, well, what is soft time? He said, having your mind and body in the same place on the inside. I think that's an incorrect statement, because I never could, after I gained a spiritual life, just have my mind on the inside and not think about what was going on the outside with my little girls and my family and my mom. It just didn't work that way. But once again, when I had those 4 years left, and I wasn't sure if I was going to get my sentence reduced or not, the thought came in my mind, can I do another 4 years? Because my release date was 2012. I got out in 2008. My release date was 2012. But I think that's one thing, my faith and belief that everything was going to be okay. And by just reading the Bible and allowing the word of God to touch my heart, allowing the word of God to become a part of me on a daily basis while I was incarcerated, I think was the main thing that just kept me going, man. And when I got my sentence released, when I got my sentence reduced, it put a boldness inside of me that all things is possible with God if we just believe. And when I got out of prison, I was at the halfway house. I got in contact with my old friend, George Brett. And George asked me to go over to his son's middle school and speak to the kids about drugs and alcohol. And I did, and he was impressed. And George said, Willie, you need to be back in baseball. He said, I'm gonna take you over to meet general manager for the Kansas City Royals, Dayton Moore. And he did. He came by the halfway house and picked me up, and I went to the game, and I talked to Dayton. And, what am I thinking would allow me to think that Dayton Moore, the general manager for the Kansas City Royals, is gonna give an old professional baseball player, convict, that just spent 14 years in prison, and he was gonna hire me as a coach with the Kansas City Royals. But once again, it goes back to my spiritual faith and the boldness that had become a part of my life and believing that I could ask anything of God and it was gonna happen. And I had doubts, and make a long story short, I talked to Dayton. It took a couple of years before it happened, but eventually, the Kansas City Royals, they hired me as a mentor and hitting instructor. And I could go on and on and on about the blessings that God has allowed to happen in my life. And I know that all of them is tied back to my spirituality and my relationship that I have with God. And that the blessings that God have bestowed upon me is because I believe that, even though I'm still a sinner and I still have to ask for forgiveness, but you don't ever forget where the blessings are coming from.
Absolutely. One last question before we open it up for all the attendees. And again, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat as we go through. One of the questions that's come to mind in listening to your story and learning about it was sort of your battle to overcome substance abuse. Can you talk a little bit about that battle and again, how your faith played a role in that? And if there are any like passages or things in the Bible that really helped fortify that struggle and give you sort of victory over it?
Well, like I said before, I took rehabilitation programs while I was incarcerated. Matter of fact, 15 months, 2 programs that were 15 months. And when I caught that, that case in 1983 with the Kansas City Royals, I didn't mention this before, but the first thing I did was I checked inside of a rehab center in Baltimore at Shepherd and Pratt. And that was on the advice of my lawyers. But I didn't check inside of Shepherd and Pratt because I thought I had a problem. I checked inside of Shepherd and Pratt so that when I went up in front of the judge was going to see that I was trying to change my life. And he was going to be lenient on me towards my sentence. It didn't work. But I never was convinced back then in the 80s that I had a drug problem. And that is one of the reasons why I went back to using drugs again. But through the rehabilitations that I had while I was incarcerated, those 14 years, through my faith in God, and just basically doing an inventory on my life. And I was in denial. And it took me a long time. That was the reason why I eventually, after the first rehabilitation program, drug rehabilitation program, I signed up for another rehabilitation program because I felt like I got something out of the first, but I didn't feel like I was at the point of where I needed to be at. And plus, there was a chance that if I finished the rehabilitation program, that it was going to be an incentive towards getting my sentence reduced. It didn't work. But basically, because of those programs, I was able to do an inventory of my life, look at the things that I had done, decide that if I wanted to stay on this path or if I wanted to change my life once I had my freedom, and wake up each day and make a decision. But, you know, the steps of the program, it deals with having a spiritual life. And I work the steps myself. I don't go to programs and stuff like that, but I work the steps through a spiritual life. And the last time I had a drink or drug was 1994, when I went to prison. So I've been clean and sober for 26 years now. Yep.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions for you that people have been sending us. One question is, Mr. Aikens, would you say that you're happier now than you were when you were playing baseball?
Well, going through with all that I've gone through, of course I am. You know, being able to survive drug addiction, being able to survive 14 years of being incarcerated. But I think most importantly, having a spiritual life and being able to see clearly how God has worked in my life and how God is still working in my life. And I told a story about my daughters being 5 and 6 when I went in, and they were 19 and 20 when I got out. So the mother of my second oldest daughter, you know, she stuck behind me all those 14 years when I was incarcerated. And I had never seen a child grow up before. So I prayed and asked God to allow me to experience that. And in 2011, my daughter, who's 9 years old right now, her name is Sarah, she was born. A month after she was born, my wife had a stroke, and my wife is paralyzed on her right side right now. But that's one of the things that I say that's made me happier today, is being able to experience a fatherhood. Whereas before, when God, he gave me those opportunities to experience being a father, and I didn't take advantage of it. And I have the nerves to get on my knees once again, the boldness, and ask God to allow me to experience it. And God answered my prayer once again. So I think my happiness today is a different happiness than I had back when I was a professional baseball player. I think my happiness back then was a selfish happiness, and it was only concerned about what was good for Willie Aikens, what worked with Willie Aikens, how much money can Willie Aikens make, how many girls can Willie Aikens chase and be with. And that kind of happiness was a selfish happiness for my own self. And today my happiness is more of a happiness with the people that surround me more than it is for me, because I'm willing to sacrifice things that in the past that made me happy that no longer makes me happy today. And I think that's the difference between the happiness that I had back when I was a professional baseball player and the happiness I have today. And it's more of a spiritual happiness, and it's more of a happiness with my relationship with Jesus Christ.
Thank you. We got two other questions that came in so far. One dealt with sort of your experience with race and racism. And we were actually talking before we went live about the events just going on today with our fallen sister, Brianna. So one of the questions was, how do you see real change happening in our criminal justice system and in society at large?
Well, I grew up in Seneca, South Carolina, back in the 50s and the 60s. And you know, I experienced racism. I saw the signs on the water fountains. I saw the signs on the bathrooms that said color only, white only. Even though I never was racist, for my first 8 years of school, I went to an all Black school. They were segregated. 1969, my high school year, the schools in South Carolina was integrated. And I truly believe that was a positive step for all Blacks, no doubt about it. But you know, this is something that has been a part of my life. I'll be 66 years old, October 14th. And this has been a part of my life for a long time, man. And you know, to see some of the stuff that is going on right now with our criminal justice system, with what is happening to her, and you know, I'm not gonna talk bad about the cops, the police, and everybody is an absolute. I'm not gonna say most people, but everybody that watch the news know what is going on in our criminal justice system. And you know, racism is something that is taught. Racism is not a part of our DNA when God, he make us. You know, that starts in your home. That starts with your friends. I got a 9-year-old daughter, and she go to a school that's probably 99% white. And you know, she saw what happened to George Floyd on TV. And I try to talk to her about something like that, and she don't understand what I'm talking about, because she don't know anything about racism. She doesn't know anything about a person being white or Black. My point is that kids, they don't see color. And we wouldn't see color that will make a difference if we wasn't taught that. I think we have to have police reform or whatever, and I'm not saying get rid of our police officers. And you know, Black on Black crime today is one of the worst things that's going on in America, man. So where does all of this start at? for us to help ourselves. I believe it starts with each and every one of us. When we get up in the mirror, when we get up in the morning and look at ourselves in the mirror, we have to come to the point where we're gonna say, well, I'm gonna do something good today. I'm not gonna go out. Some people wake up in the morning and their plan is to go out and kill somebody. Their plan is to go out and sell drugs. Their plan is to go out and commit a crime. So it starts with each and every one of us before it starts with the politics, local police, or whatever. If we as individuals don't decide to make a change in our lives, well, guess what? There is not going to be a change in the criminal justice system. I don't care how many laws that are passed. I don't care how much reform is done with the police department. And you know, there are some cops out there that, hey, they're in situations and they have to make a split decision. And a lot of times the choices that they make are bad choices. And they are getting away with the bad choices. That is just the way it is. But to answer the questions of what needs to be done, I think it falls upon each and every one of us, the people that are committing the crimes. You know, the criminal justice system, like I said before, I got out of prison in 2008. 12 years, now it's 2020. And I haven't had any problem with the police department or the criminal justice system. And the reason is because I made a conscious decision that I didn't want to be a part of that. And once you become a part of that and you experience what happened to a person that is incarcerated, and you get out of prison and decide that I can beat this system, or you decide that, well, I got friends that have been dealing drugs for 10 or 15 years and they've never got caught. So I believe I know how to beat the system. Now, this is the way a lot of people think, because I heard them when I was in prison for those 14 years. They got it all figured out. And then they get out and they get killed, or they ended up going back to prison again. So I think it starts with us as individuals, that we have to make a conscious decision that I'm not gonna do that anymore. And until we do, we're still gonna have problems in America. We're still gonna have these protests. We're still gonna have cops that are doing what they are doing. We're still gonna have the black neighborhoods of Kansas City, the black neighborhoods of Chicago, the black neighborhoods of Baltimore, waking up each day and killing each other, killing our own selves, and that's sad.
Excuse me, a couple more questions that have also come in. One that's somewhat related deals with kind of the issue of choices that people are making and kind of the resources and services to help. Someone asked, how would you describe some of the rehabilitation services that you received while in prison, and how helpful did you think they were in kind of helping you sort of conquer substance abuse?
I think they were very helpful to me. Most people that go to prison, I'm not gonna say all, but most people that go to prison have accepted responsibility for what they've done. So if you are sitting in prison and you think you haven't done anything wrong, but then you are not gonna seek rehabilitation for yourself. And once again, that was the reason why I seeked rehabilitation for myself, because I thought I was gonna help. I thought I was gonna get my sentence reduced if I finished the program. Incentives, and that's all right. I mean, if there's an incentive, the incentive should be to help yourself out, to try to live a better life. But once again, I took 2A programs. So I felt like the first program was giving me something, but it hadn't given me everything that I needed. So I rejoined the second program. And once again, it's a correctional system. And you know, I haven't been a part of that system for the past 12 years. I would imagine that they have more programs now in state and federal that the inmates can seek to better their lives. But once again, it's up to the individual that's incarcerated to make a decision that this is what I want to do. And until that decision is made, well, then you probably going to go to prison and get out worse than what you was before you went in. And I can truly say that me taking those programs and allowing me to do an inventory of myself and allowing me to accept responsibility for what I had done and allowing me to gain a spiritual life, all of those things helped me while I was incarcerated. And it can help anybody that decides to make a decision like that.
Mr. Aikens, we have a couple questions about prison conditions. And so related to what you just said, is prison the best place to offer some of those resources and those rehabilitation programs for individuals? Or might there be better community-based options and other resources that we could put into communities that might prevent people from having to go to prison in the first place?
Well, like I said before, I know some states, they have drug courts, and if you commit a crime that is related to drugs, well, they give you the option of going to a program, and if you finish that program, you don't go to prison. That wasn't an option for me. And you know, I committed a crime, but I was not a criminal. You know, I had money. I used drugs because I liked to get a high. And there wasn't anything in place back then that was an option for the judge to send me to a rehabilitation program. Even though part of my sentence was I had to take a rehabilitation, it was only like a 40-hour rehabilitation program. That was part of my sentence. I ended up finishing that sentence, and I also took the other 2 rehabilitation programs. But each case is different. And there was no criminal history for me that said I was a drug dealer. Or there was no activity in my life that the cops saw to believe that I was a criminal and that I was dealing drugs. Once again, my crime was I got drugs for a female who showed up at my house, and I was trying to develop a relationship with her. That was my crime. It wasn't like they caught me, people coming in and out at my house, and I was selling drugs and everything like that. But once again, to answer your question, I don't even know if our system have anything in place. I know some states do. I don't think I did a federal crime. I don't think in the federal system there's anything that says that, you know, if you complete this program or whatever. But once again, you have a lot of people that are incarcerated because of mental health. You have more people that are in prison than you do at facilities that are supposed to help people that have mental health. You have more people that are incarcerated that are drug addicts and alcoholics that need the help than at rehabilitation programs. So that's a problem.
Yeah.
It's a problem that needs to be looked at, and it's a problem that needs to be taken care of. Because if you go to prison and you are a drug addict and alcoholic, and there's no place that you can seek help to try to help yourself, well, guess what? When you get out of prison, you're still gonna be a drug addict and alcoholic, and you're probably gonna get back on drugs and alcohol again, which is gonna lead you back down that same street to doing crimes.
Yeah, it seems like the criminal justice system seems to be the go-to place for solving a lot of our social problems. And, you know, if the only place you could go to get good counseling or good rehabilitation programs is prison, we probably should look at that in terms of having additional places where people could get preventive care separate from the system of the criminal justice system.
And the thing is, when you go to prison, that's not the focus of the system to help people out. Like if you check inside of a rehabilitation program, the focus of a rehabilitation program is to help you overcome your addiction. When you go to prison, that's not the focus of being in prison. The focus of being in prison is to get you off the streets, because society believes that you are a danger to other people that are free out in the world. And in some ways that is true, but in a lot of ways, it's only true because you haven't dealt with your problem of addiction. And once that problem of addiction is dealt with or fixed, well, then you can go back to the free world and live a crime-free life.
Yeah, I think that's a very good place to end it on, and I think that's kind of where we are from a criminal justice perspective. I think we're starting to realize that it should be more about prevention and rehabilitation and less about punishment and the punitive aspect of what you experienced 25 years ago.
And we haven't got to that point in America yet.
We're getting there, I think.
And I don't know if we will ever get to that point.
Any outstanding questions from the attendees? Now's your time to add them to the Q&A on the bottom of the Zoom screen.
I did see one that popped up. And the question dealt with kind of what is your perspective, Mr. Aikens, on sort of the impact of religion in prison, kind of on inmates in general?
Well, there's all type of religious groups that are in prison. I don't want to say anything bad about the groups, but some people become affiliated with those groups for protection. That wasn't a part of my criteria why I rededicated my life to Christ. I did it not for the real reason at first, but later on in my life for the real reason. But each to his own. But just like they have different games, the Crips, the Bloods, Mexican Mafia, it's the same thing with the religious groups. Well, from what I've seen and what I saw and believe is that most people, they join those groups for protection and just to be affiliated with other people. And I had one incident. I got into a fight while I was incarcerated with a guy who was a Muslim. And he attacked me, but I got blamed for it because I got the best of him, not trying to brag or anything, but I had only been at this place. It was in Estelle, South Carolina, Estelle. And I had only been there for about, I don't know, maybe 8 months or whatever. Make a long story short, they had to separate us. And this is the word from the DHO who studied that case. He said, Mr. Aikens, we have to separate you because this guy is a part of two gangs. He's a Muslim and he's a Crip. So if we put you back on the compound, your life might be in danger because he's a Muslim and he's a Crip. So right there, it says it all.
We have two final questions, and maybe you can answer them together. One is on your experience with any court costs or fees associated with debts incurred in prison. And the other is any support that you might have received upon your release in terms of employment assistance or housing upon your release from prison.
Well, I didn't receive any support from any government or whatever once I got out of prison. And when I got out of prison, I was dead broke. And when I went to prison, I had $500,000 in my account. And everything I had, I spent it on my little girls. I took care of them. But I want to go back to 1983 and tell a story about what happened to us. It was myself and 3 of my teammates. And at my sentencing, I got sentenced with Willie Wilson. We got sentenced to a year in prison. 9 months suspended. So we ended up doing 3 months, 81 days. But 3 of the 4 defendants was Black. And 1 of the defendant was white. And we all are Major League A baseball players. You know, this just shows you how some people think. But myself and the 2 other Black guys received the same sentence, and we received the same fine of $5,000. But the white guy received the same sentence, but he received a sentence of $2,500. You know, I've never had an answer for that question. Why did the white guy receive half of the sentence or fine? He was fined half of what the 3 Black guys had to pay. But one of my friends, when I got out of prison, you know, he loaned me $10,000. And while I was at the halfway house, I got in contact with one of my old friends, Hal McCray, who I played with 4 years here in Kansas City. And most people know who Hal McCray is. And if I would have taken the advice of Hal McCray in 1983, while I was a professional baseball player, I would have never got caught, because he told me to stop doing what I was doing, and I didn't pay him any attention. But I bring up Hal because when I was at the halfway house, I got in contact with Hal. And Hal, he was living in Florida, but he had lived in Blue Springs, Missouri for years. And he knew this lady who owned a construction company. So he gave me a number. He said, Willie, I want you to call this number. I want you to get in contact with her. I think she might have a job for you. So I called her up. Her name was Linda, and she hired me. And I was making $25 an hour, 2008. And this was a tremendous help for me. But because I played in the major leagues for almost 7 years, I had a baseball pension coming. So this was like in June. So I filed for my baseball pension to start November 1st. So my situation as far as my finances was concerned was that I was blessed because I was a professional baseball player, and I had my baseball pension coming, and I had my baseball pension for life. And I ended up getting that construction job making $25 an hour. Once again, I'm getting all of these blessings and things that are happening for me. But once again, when I got out of prison, I was dead broke. You know, most people that go to prison and spend 14 years in prison is dead broke. And they are forgotten about. And a lot of people that spend a whole lot of time in prison like that, you know, the stigma is that when you become a felon, ain't nobody gonna hire you. And see, that kind of thinking allow people to go back to criminal activity. You know, I never had the criminal thinking mind of a criminal. I never thought that if I couldn't find a job, I was going to go back to selling drugs, because even though I got the drugs from an undercover officer, this wasn't something that I did to make money off of. So I never had those kind of thoughts. But a lot of people, they have those thoughts. And that's one of the reasons when they get out of prison, the easiest thing for them to do is to go back to doing criminal activity and make the so-called easy money.
Thank you very much. Well, I realize we've kind of come to the end of our official time. So first of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Aikens, for coming and sharing with us, and for all those who were able to join. You know, a lot of good food for thought about religion, race, criminal justice system, and kind of what challenges lie before us in the 21st century. Hopefully people who were here are able to enjoy it and learn something, and hopefully be inspired in their own lives, as well as in kind of the collective lives of University of Scranton and other universities that are represented here. So thank you so much for your time and everyone for organizing all of this.
Well, Joel, I want to thank Joel and Michael. I want to thank you guys for your leadership and everything that you have done and everything that you're still doing to help people in this world. I think one of the most important things that we can do is to help somebody else. You know, that's become a part of my life. That's what I live to do. And I just hope that some of the information that I put out there, I hope I answered the questions okay. I hope my experience in this world will be able to help somebody else, that when they get in a situation like I've been in, they'll see how I came out of that situation, and they'll also be able to make some better decisions than what I made. You know, not everybody is a professional baseball player, but we still go through the same thing in life. We still have to wake up each day and decide what we're going to do. So it's been an honor. It's been a pleasure. And God bless you guys. David, Martin, Kyla, Ryan, Joel, Michael, everybody else on this call. Enjoyed myself. And I just praise God that he has allowed me to be a part of something like this.
Thank you. That'll conclude our event. Thank you all for attending. And there is a recording that will be available to you by tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.